Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Backlog Busters, where I'm busting out my gaming backlog one video at a time and letting you know if after all these years, these games are worth playing today. In this episode, I'm finding out if Sonic the Hedgehog deserved to be the Sega Genesis mascot, or if he was just a pretender to the throne, while the true lineage of kings was pushed to the side, by playing through Ristar, Rocket Knight Adventures, and Pulseman. My parents were extremely hesitant to provide me with a console and games of my own. Maybe they were worried I'd never leave the house again or become some weird gamer. But those same protections didn't apply to comics, as I had unrestricted access to the Archie Sonic the Hedgehog comics, filled with some of the strangest characters, storylines, and love triangles I've ever read. But between those pages filled with filth were advertisements for the Sega Genesis and its games, with Rocket Knight Adventures and Ristar being featured heavily and looking way past cool. But I had no Genesis console, and no friends had those games. Then years passed until I eventually gained entry into the world of gaming myself, with the Game Boy Color and Pokemon Yellow, after which I discovered that my new favorite developer, Game Freak, made non-Pokemon games for the Nintendo occasionally. But I still lacked a Genesis and knew no one who had a copy of Pulseman. But those years of missing out end today. And no, I may not actually be qualified to render a verdict on whether these games eclipse the original Sonic the Hedgehog trilogy, as I've not actually finished any of those games, but that won't stop me. So let's find out who's going to receive the sought-after Sega Genesis mascot platformer crown, starting with Ristar, because that's the one I finished first. Ristar's origins sound like a joke. Apparently Sega requested a competitor to Mario, with one team presenting a rabbit who could pick up objects with its ears. But Sega rejected this idea as it was too complex, instead moving on to rolling characters and eventually Sonic. Then years later, this idea resurfaced under the codename Feel, with a character that could pick up objects, but not with something ridiculous like ears, this time with gloved human hands. Say hello to Ristar. I immediately liked this game, and not in a what a cool character kind of way, but because this character is frankly horrifying. At no point did I assume the character trait of can pick up objects equated to extends arms, holds enemies captive, and stares deeply into their soul. The intensity of that stare, while enemies struggle to escape Ristar's vice-like grip before being headbutted into oblivion, isn't such a complex concept that you have to create Sonic instead. It's more a concept and an image you'd just like to forget. But if you can move past what Ristar is doing to these poor innocent lizards, there's a really fun game here. You've got a jump button and a hands button. This combination will let you swing from enemies to reach higher platforms and even spin until you reach supersonic speeds and can just fly for a short amount of time. Ristar's also got the grip strength of a great climber, as you fling across these stages more fluidly than any 2D Spider-Man game I've ever played. And after all these years, I finally found the inspiration for Lara Croft's full body flip that both her and Ristar execute when climbing over simple ledges. But a few interesting grab mechanics would fall flat if there weren't levels filled with interesting obstacles and enemies. Luckily, Ristar surprised me throughout with quite a bit of variety, featuring almost puzzle-like areas to climb through. Areas so slick you'll be unable to stop, having to use your jumps and hands to not fall off the stage. Enemies that vary between weak ones, useful for platforming, and imposing robots that can only be defeated by grabbing their feet to throw them off balance. Even the bosses in this game use your limited actions in really unique ways, and yes, they do involve grabbing and jumping, but you'll end up having a snowball fight, or taking way too many attempts to memorize the order of 6 enemies and grab them very carefully in that order. And there's a lot more surprises that I kinda don't want to spoil. Plus, this game just looks great in motion, with these very Sonic-style level intros, extremely detailed and bright art, and really emotive and well-done animations, even if most of them are enemies fighting for their lives against these hands of steel. And although I didn't find them all, I really love these bonus stages. Each of them features a unique challenge or obstacle, like one all about these climbing rings, another being about swinging, and an incredibly tough one that tests the limits of Ristar's reach. The only negative thing I have to say about Ristar is that the game just has some punishingly hard areas and bosses, which, in conjunction with the timeless idea that losing all your lives means you should start the game over from level 1, can make for a frustrating experience. These spikes in difficulty felt even more sudden to me with how short the game is. At only 2 hours long, it felt like I was just being taught some mechanics only to have final exams right around the corner. Which is unfortunate because there are some really fun and extremely unique mechanics and levels introduced even in the final stage. But thankfully, any modern port of this game does contain save states, so you can practice and hone your skills on a difficult level or boss without restarting constantly. Unless you've got a whole summer break and no responsibilities, so you can spend time honing your skills until you breeze through this with no damage, but that's not me. So let's move on to the next game. Rocket Knight Adventures is a game I only knew by way of advertisements. This might explain why I thought I was going to play as a tough little mouse named Sparkster, and I'm actually playing as a possum suited up in armor not for protection from oncoming cars like I would have assumed, but instead as a sign of knighthood in this futuristic yet medieval setting where you defend the kingdom from an army of evil pigs and their pig star. But in case you're worried about getting stuck in a text crawl explaining the far, far away galaxy, don't. Because most of that's just from the manual. Instead, you're thrown right into the action, fighting back as your kingdom is under siege by what looks like a giant crab. Now, it did take some time for my eyes to adjust, as the neon levels with that Sonic style are gone. Instead, this game features a more muted style, which is really more in line with how I remember Genesis games looking. But it's got a charm all its own, especially with its animations. As you cut down the angry pig invaders, their armor shatters, reduced to boxers as they run away crying. And no matter how serious Sparkster looks with his glasses on, there's just a liveliness and a humor to a lot of the enemies here. Also, I'm not sure if this was intentionally a humorous addition, but seeing the blank, smiling expression on Sparkster's face as he just stares at the white void around him after murdering hordes of enemies never failed to make me laugh. But where this game most shines is in its moment-to-moment gameplay. Compared to Ristar's leisurely walk and grip that feels downright slow by comparison, Sparkster chops with a speed that's only limited by your reflexes, and even without a full set of hearts, you can use what amounts to the sword beam from the Legend of Zelda series all the time here. Plus, Sparkster is seemingly unafraid of splinters as they hang and slide across tree bark with a roller coaster-like speed. You can also hold the attack button to charge up your rocket attack that launches you at enemies with your sword outstretched. But don't worry, you won't dull your blade if you hit a wall or some spikes. Sparkster is invincible when using this attack and will ricochet off any obstacle ping-ponging around without a care in the world. The speed at which this game plays was a little shocking at first, but it feels so snappy and responsive, especially with that dizzying bounce attack that's just so satisfying to pull off. Now, this game does feel less like a platformer than I expected because most of your time will be spent just in boss battles. You'll platform through the intro area, only to have the screen lock as you fight off an ambush, then challenge a tank on a bridge which collapses, and as you continue the fight while falling down a waterfall, only to land for just a split second before you're flying around in what feels like an arcade shooter. It really reminds me of Cuphead, where there's some connective tissue in the platforming levels in between multi-stage boss fights with a unique feel in each of them. And there are some really unique non-boss levels here, with lava that's so reflective it lets you see behind the stalactites blocking your normal view, or an airship where you avoid barrels like Donkey Kong until making it to the scaffolding below, where you hang on for dear life and knock bombs into a mini-boss below you. Plus, there are just interesting touches throughout the game, like the early flying stage, which actually lets you dip into the water, which drastically slows down your speed. Or utilizing your rocket bounce to pass dangerous spikes that can't easily be leapt through. But the second I mentioned Cuphead, you probably knew what the negative might be. If you thought Ristar had some difficult stages, get ready for Rocket Knight Adventures, which at least does have a selectable difficulty option that adjusts the number of lives, continues, and enemy damage. But even with that, the classic die too many times and start the game over system is still here, so save states are once again your friend. But believe me, I will be looking up a no-hit run of this game the second I'm done recording this, just to marvel at the dexterity that I lack and will never have. But let's rocket over to the next game. Pulseman, Game Freak's second Sega Genesis game, and also its last, only arrived on Western shores through the Sega Channel, a service that kind of amazingly let players access demos, games, and cheat codes through a coax cable. So I feel like this game might be on a lot of people's backlogs as it's only been wildly available in re-released forms on the Wii and the Switch. The best way I can describe the look of Pulseman is by saying it looks like a GBA game. Is this partially because the sprites of humans in this game could pass for any Pokemon trainer in the GBA entries? Yes. But also something about the background art, the character Pulseman, and just the overall look and style reminds me of the GBA Mega Man games and Game Freak's own Drill Dozer game. It's an odd feeling that maybe only I have, that I'm somehow seeing the GBA style of pixel art show up in a Genesis game 10 years before the last Game Boy ever existed. But after my confusion wore off, I did not get the hype. I completed the first level and took a break, thinking maybe I should play a different Genesis game. The movement felt slow, the attacks had a really short range, and I just wasn't impressed after coming from two other immediately satisfying Genesis games. But then I had a thought. What if I'm missing some ability or misunderstanding the controls in some way? So I went to look up a manual for the game since there's no in-game tutorial and found out this game uses a third button. In my Genesis Gauntlet I'd been participating in, I'd gotten so used to just 2 buttons, I didn't even think of trying the others. And if I did, I still wouldn't have worked this out because the controls are a little weird in this game. If you move in one direction, you'll build up speed and electricity. And when you see visible sparks, Pulseman's short punch ability changes into a ranged attack. Or you can press that third button to trigger your Volseer ability, which I'll just call Volt. This ability is very similar to Sparkster's Rocket Dash ability, bouncing you around the stage and damaging enemies. Plus, you can double tap the D-pad to do a quick kind of dash that instantly recharges your Volt ability and can be used as a kind of dodge in a pinch. Unsurprisingly, once I actually learned how to control the game, it felt a lot better and actually clicked. Reminded me a lot of the Azure Striker Gunvolt series where you also manage your electric charge, and in general this game has a lot of Mega Man vibes going for it. Except that in this game, the Dr. Light stand-in falls in love with an AI, goes into the computer to be with her, and Pulseman, who can exist in and out of the virtual world, is quote-unquote born. Or at least that's what Google Translate tells me because the very few lines of exposition in this game are not fully translated. It really feels like a more punchy Mega Man game, even featuring those pesky blocks that you need to time your jumps around. And you'll mainly use a combination of your jumps and Volt abilities to navigate these levels, which become a little more maze-like and will have you figuring out ways to cross gaps, reach high levels, and generally build your spark up in order to navigate to the next boss or area. You'll be traveling in and out of computers, finding secret paths, sparking along wires, and even learning how to escape underwater sections where you're unable to generate a spark and have a much more limited moveset. But sadly, Pulseman is the shortest of all of these games, and I think it shows as the abilities of Pulseman weren't nearly as well explored as in Ristar or Rocket Knight Adventures. And while I enjoyed most of the boss fights and they were inventive, some use Pulseman's abilities in ways that were never taught beforehand or ever used again. And the standard levels kind of blended together much more here than in any of the other games I played this time, with less variety and interesting uses of the abilities you're given. Also, when you're inside the virtual world, these backgrounds might be the closest I've ever come to getting dizzy or feeling sick from playing a game. Some of these are so disorienting and distracting, it makes it kind of hard to play at points. There's also just odd control quirks like the double tap to dash and refill your electricity, which doesn't seem to work on any uneven surfaces and just isn't as enjoyable or very easy to pull off in the heat of battle. Now with all that in mind, would I recommend any of these games beyond your backlog? For Ristar, I'd say yes. I loved this game, and I don't know why I put it off for so long. I kept thinking back to my time with Donkey Kong Country 2, which kept introducing new ideas and twists on existing ones, and Ristar felt very similar in the way it really used every ability and enemy in new and surprising ways. But again, Ristar can be really unforgiving, and without the help of save states, I could see frustration overwhelming some of the more fun aspects. Rocket Knight Adventures, I'd also say yes to, because while it does feel more like a boss rush extravaganza, I loved how fast and frantic it plays. With such strange bosses and scenarios coming up, I was always excited to see what was next. It maybe feels a little less cohesive because sometimes you're not even controlling Sparkster, or you're flying, which feels like a whole different game. But this mode shifting is also really exciting and something I've not really experienced in other games. But how I wish this game was broken up into smaller levels, had more checkpoints, or just let you save and continue trying a stage without restarting the entire game. Because it gets very difficult, but I never got so frustrated I wanted to stop playing thanks to save states. And finally, for Pulseman, I just don't think I'd recommend it. It's not bad, it just feels more rough around the edges with much less polish than the other 2 games I played today. Plus, it doesn't exhibit much variety in the stages, which started to feel a little samey as the game went on, not really exploring your abilities fully. I really enjoyed the art style here, and especially the boss fights. But Pulseman feels like a game I'd love to see a sequel expand on its ideas, sand off those rough edges, and just see it really shine. And I'll throw out my normal message. My opinion on these games is not meant to tarnish any fond memories you have of playing these, and if you loved or still love these games, tell me why in the comments below. I'd love to hear about your experience and talk more about these games. Now, if you're looking to play or replay any of these games, it's a mixed bag. Ristar's easy. It's been ported right alongside the original Sonic to almost every platform out there, the most recent of which is the confusingly named Nintendo Switch Online Plus expansion pack. But with it included on so many other Genesis collections through the years, if you've got access to Sonic 1 or Sonic 2, you probably have access to Ristar. Rocket Knight Adventures, on the other hand, is lost to time, without a single port ever being released as far as I could tell. There was a sequel released for the Genesis called Sparkster, and a wholly different side game slash spin-off also called Sparkster that came to the Super Nintendo. And then in 2010, another sequel, simply titled Rocket Knight this time, released, which remains the only Rocket Knight anything that you can purchase and play today. Then finally, Pulseman, which actually showed up on the Nintendo Switch Online Plus expansion pack subscription service back in April of this year, which is very much appreciated since it never received a physical release in North America. And while it did get ported to the Wii Virtual Console, that's long dead. So I'm very appreciative and kind of surprised that this one's actually easily playable. But that's all I've got to say about these games for today. Have you played any of these? What did you think? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to talk more about these. And please send over any suggestions you have for games I should clear off my backlog next. Thank you all so much for watching, and see you in the next video. Bye.